My aunt and uncle offered to fund my entire wedding as amends for what their son did, but the real reason they were paying made me physically sick, and when they showed up with him on my wedding day, what happened next was something none of us could have planned. 5 years ago, my life was dismantled in a single morning. My fiancée Sophie had left a tear-stained notebook open on the bedside table, a confession written out in full. She had been sleeping with my cousin Bradley for months and could not go through with the wedding. Bradley, who had stood beside me at the rehearsal the night before as my best man. Bradley, who had helped me choose the ring. Bradley, who I had genuinely believed was one of the most important people in my life. To understand what that felt like, you need to know who Bradley was in our family. He had always been the golden one, the achiever, the charmer, the one who made our grandparents beam with pride, and who could do no wrong in anyone's eyes. Teachers had praised him. Relatives talked about him at every gathering. I had admired him genuinely, without jealousy, which I think made the betrayal cut in a particular way. You expect enemies to hurt you. You do not expect the person you admired most. And while I had been standing next to him at that rehearsal, thinking about how fortunate I was to have him in my corner, he had already been working quietly for months to destroy everything I had. The fallout tore through the family immediately and badly. Some sided with Bradley. Love is complicated. These things happen. I should eventually find a way to forgive. Others, my parents and siblings among them, cut ties with Bradley and his parents entirely and did not waver. The divide only deepened 6 months later when Bradley and Sophie married. They appeared at mutual events, posted pictures together, moved through shared spaces as though the wreckage they had left behind was simply not worth acknowledging. I could not stay in the same city. I moved away, started a business, kept my head down, and spent the years between then and now doing the slow, unglamorous work of learning how to trust people again. Then I met Rachel. Rachel was different from Sophie in every way that mattered. She was steady and honest and patient with the parts of me that were still quietly broken. When we decided to get married, I wanted something small. Just the people who genuinely mattered, nothing performative. That was when Bradley's parents, my Aunt Helen and Uncle Richard, approached me with what they called an olive branch. They wanted to fund the entire wedding. They said it was their way of making amends for what their son had done. I was immediately skeptical and said so. My parents told me not to accept under any circumstances. Rachel thought differently. She felt it might offer a genuine path toward some kind of closure, and she had a way of making me see possibilities I had already closed the door on. Some part of me still wanted to believe that people were capable of meaning what they said, that change was actually possible if you gave it room. Against my instincts and against my parents' clear advice, I agreed. The planning went ahead, and on the surface, everything looked considered and sincere. Helen took charge of most of the arrangements, but always checked with us first, always appeared to be listening. She suggested hosting the ceremony at their countryside estate, a property that had been in the family for generations and carried a certain weight of history. And the gesture seemed to carry real meaning. It felt like something genuine was being offered, like the kind of thing people do when they are genuinely trying to repair something. What I did not know was that it was none of those things, not a single part of it. My cousin Lucy, who had been staying at the estate in the weeks leading up to the wedding, overheard a late-night conversation between Helen and Sophie. They were going through a plan. Bradley was going to arrive at the wedding with Sophie and their 2 children, present himself as a changed man, deliver what they had apparently scripted as a heartfelt public apology, and use the occasion to reintegrate himself into the wider family after years of estrangement. Helen had hired a professional photographer specifically to capture the moment. The whole reunion was going to be documented and posted across social media as evidence of Bradley's personal growth and transformation. My wedding was to be the stage. I was to be the prop. When Lucy told me what she had overheard, I had to sit down. I felt physically ill in a way that I had not felt since the morning I found Sophie's notebook. 5 years of therapy, of slowly learning to trust again, of rebuilding from the ground up, piece by piece. And Helen had looked at all of that and seen an opportunity, a backdrop, the perfect setting for her son's comeback story, the betrayed cousin, healed and generous and forgiving, providing the emotional frame for Bradley's return to the family fold. That was all I was to them, a stage. I told Rachel everything the night Lucy came to me with what she had heard. Rachel sat with all of it quietly, and when I finished, she told me to wait and see. She said she had a feeling their plan was going to collapse entirely on its own. She knew her brothers and what they were capable of when they felt someone they loved was being wronged. She knew our guests and how long memories were in tight communities. She knew how these things tended to go when real, unmanaged people were involved, rather than the careful version of events Helen had constructed in her own head. Rachel's instincts were, as I have come to understand is almost always the case. Exactly right. Update 1. The wedding day arrived, and the estate was genuinely beautiful. Fairy lights through the old oak trees, white roses throughout the garden, the afternoon sun making everything glow in a way that felt too perfect for what I now knew was coming. What Helen and Richard had not accounted for was the nature of the people who would be standing in that garden. Most of our guests knew the full story of what had happened 5 years ago. This was a tight community, and the story had never fully faded. They had also completely underestimated Rachel's family, specifically her 3 older brothers, Adam, Oliver, and Sean, who had heard everything about my history and were not people who stood quietly to one side when something felt wrong. At around 3:30, while guests were still arriving, a commotion broke out at the estate's main entrance. Bradley, Sophie, and their 2 children had arrived, dressed immaculately and carrying gift bags as though they had every right to be there. Helen rushed out to meet them wearing the smile of someone who believes their plan is working perfectly. It was not. Adam, who had been helping coordinate parking, spotted them the moment they stepped out of the car. He alerted his brothers and several trusted guests, and within minutes word had moved through the gathering crowd. By the time Bradley and his family reached the garden, they found themselves facing a wall of disapproving faces. My old friend James, who had been with me through the worst of the fallout 5 years ago, stepped forward first. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Bradley calmly and asked whether he had received an invitation. The question sat in the air. Sophie tightened her grip on Bradley's arm. Helen rushed over to intervene, explaining that she had personally invited them. Oliver, Rachel's middle brother, a quiet, methodical man by nature, spoke next. He pointed out, with the kind of measured patience that lands harder than anger, that contributing financially to a wedding did not give anyone the right to override the guest list set by the people getting married. The murmurs of agreement from the surrounding guests grew audible. Helen launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about reconciliation and second chances. It found no audience. Several guests began sharing their own recollections of how Bradley and Sophie had behaved in the years following the affair, showing up at shared events together, acting as though nothing had happened, while I was still trying to piece my life back together. The stories came from people I had not known were paying attention, and there were more of them than I had realized. Then, my grandmother made her way through the crowd, slowly and deliberately, and everyone seemed to sense what was about to happen because they parted without being asked. She had stayed carefully neutral when everything first happened 5 years ago. Bradley had always been her favorite grandchild, and she had not been willing to sever that. She had kept her door open and hoped that time would eventually produce something better. She walked up to Bradley and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said quietly and clearly that she was not disappointed in what he had done years ago. She was disappointed that he had chosen to come here today, knowing exactly what it would cost me. Sean, Rachel's youngest brother, and a professional event coordinator who had quietly been preparing for exactly this possibility, stepped forward. He announced that he and his siblings had already arranged a backup venue, the lakeside restaurant where Rachel and I had our first date, and that everything was in place. He had prepared for this. The thought of it hit me somewhere I cannot easily name. Without drama, without any confrontation or raised voices, our guests simply began moving toward the car park. A quiet, dignified departure that communicated everything without a single harsh word needing to be said. It was, in its own way, the most powerful thing that happened all day. I caught a last glimpse of Helen and Richard standing on the estate steps, with Bradley and Sophie beside them, their elaborate, year-long plan in pieces at their feet. The wedding at the lakeside restaurant was everything we had originally wanted, and everything the estate could never have been. Intimate, warm, completely genuine, and entirely unscripted. Some of the best moments of the day were unplanned. They happened simply because the right people were in the room and nobody was performing for anyone else. Rachel was extraordinary. I stood across from her and said what I meant, and I have never felt so certain of anything in my life. The restaurant staff, who had been given almost no notice, pulled everything together with a warmth that I will not forget. It felt like exactly the right place to begin. Update 2. 3 weeks on, and the full scale of what had been planned continued to emerge through people who had stayed at the estate after we left. Helen had apparently fallen apart once the exodus began. In her distress, she started explaining the scheme to the remaining guests, seemingly believing she could still justify it if she described the intentions behind it clearly enough. What she actually produced was a thorough public account of how calculated it had all been. They had been planning this for over a year. The wedding had been chosen specifically because it guaranteed that family members who had distanced themselves from Bradley would all be in the same place. Helen had hired a professional photographer whose sole purpose was to capture the reunion. The detail that stopped me cold, She and Richard had been making monthly deposits into a separate account for 2 years, specifically saving for the opportunity to fund someone's wedding and engineer this moment. They had first approached my cousin Lisa when she got engaged. She had declined. When they heard about my engagement to Rachel, they apparently saw it as something close to fate. Sophie's role in the planning became clearer too. She had prepared a speech about growth and forgiveness that she intended to deliver at the reception. The fact that she had believed this would be received warmly said everything about how thoroughly disconnected from reality she had become. The aftermath affected Bradley more than anyone seemed to have expected. Several guests reported seeing him argue with Sophie in the car park after everyone had left. Apparently he had been hesitant about the whole plan, but had been talked around by Sophie and his parents, who were convinced it would work. The public rejection, and especially his grandmother's words, appeared to have done something to him that nothing else had managed in 5 years. My grandmother made a decision shortly afterward that sent shockwaves through the family. She withdrew the inheritance she had planned to leave Bradley and his immediate family, redirecting it into an educational trust for all her other grandchildren's future children. She had spent years maintaining connections on all sides. The wedding had finally made clear to her what that neutrality had been enabling. Helen and Richard's standing in their social and professional circles began to erode quickly. Business associates who had attended as family friends started creating distance. The pattern of manipulation the wedding had revealed made people reconsider their own histories with them. Wedding vendors came forward separately with details that added further dimensions to how carefully everything had been prepared. The florist had received a request to add Sophie's favorite flowers to Rachel's bouquet without our knowledge. The wedding coordinator had been approached about last-minute seating adjustments to position Bradley's family at prominent tables near the front. The scheme had been embedded into the logistics of the day itself. Sophie's parents, who had been silent for 5 years, reached out through Rachel's family to apologize to me. They had opposed the marriage to Bradley from the beginning and had been essentially pressured into accepting it through Helen and Richard's social and financial influence. Their account completed a picture of a pattern of control that had been running for far longer than I had understood. The professional photographs from the lakeside wedding arrived, and they were everything the estate ceremony could never have been: candid, joyful, completely unposed. There is one photograph of the entire group forming a spontaneous dance line on the restaurant deck that has become something of a symbol for everyone who was there, proof that the best moments cannot be planned or manufactured. Update 3. 2 months have passed, and the ripple effects continue to surface in ways I did not anticipate. The most significant development came from Bradley himself. He reached out through a mutual cousin, asking if I would be willing to meet privately. No parents, no Sophie, just the two of us. I discussed it carefully with Rachel before agreeing. We met at a quiet coffee shop in a town that belonged to neither of us. The man who sat across from me was not the cousin I remembered. The confidence that had always defined him was gone. He told me the wedding had forced him, for the first time, to actually look at what he had done. Not from a comfortable distance, managed by his parents' constant intervention, but directly and without escape. His grandmother's words had stayed with him in a way he had not anticipated. He told me his marriage to Sophie was falling apart. The failure of the wedding plan had exposed fractures in their relationship that had apparently been there for years. Sophie had been the primary driver of the reconciliation attempt. She had wanted desperately to be accepted back into the family and the social world she had lost access to when the affair became known. When the plan collapsed, she had blamed Bradley for not being convincing enough in his performance of a changed man. He said the argument they had in the estate car park that day had been the worst of their marriage, and that the weeks since had not been much better. He told me he was beginning to ask himself honestly whether what they had built together was ever real, or whether it had been two people holding on to a relationship, because admitting it was a mistake would mean confronting too much. He admitted something else I had not fully grasped before. His seemingly successful life, the career, the family, the image of someone who had landed well, had been largely sustained by his parents' money and constant management. He had never genuinely faced a consequence for anything. The estate had been the first moment when Helen and Richard could not step in and make something right, and standing there without a safety net had been, by his own account, the most clarifying thing that had ever happened to him. Whether Bradley is capable of real change is not something I can know from one conversation, but I left that coffee shop with something I had not expected, not forgiveness exactly, but the absence of the weight I had been carrying. There is a difference between the two, and it matters. Helen and Richard have retreated from family gatherings, citing a need for time and space. The irony of two people who tried to force their way uninvited into our most intimate celebration, now requiring solitude and quiet reflection, is not lost on anyone in the family. Their absence has quietly allowed something genuine to begin settling among the rest of us. Rachel and I are expecting our first child next spring, which has added a layer of clarity to everything. Every conversation about family dynamics, about what we model and what we protect against, now has a concrete focus that it did not have before. The whole experience, all of it, from the estate to the lakeside restaurant to the coffee shop meeting with Bradley, has made us think carefully and deliberately about what we want to build, about the difference between relationships maintained out of obligation and those built on genuine care, about the kind of home we want to create for a child who will grow up watching how we treat people and what we refuse to accept. Our Sunday dinners have grown. Cousins who kept their distance for years have quietly reappeared, and the conversations at these gatherings have a quality I do not remember from family events growing up. People say what they actually think. There is less performance, less careful management of appearances, less of the particular exhaustion that comes from pretending everything is fine when it clearly is not. I had not realized how much of my energy at family gatherings had gone into managing that pretense until it was no longer required. I am not angry anymore. What Helen and Richard attempted was calculated and cold, and it failed completely. But the failure of their plan produced something they never intended. It gave everyone around them permission to stop pretending, to stop maintaining relationships built on obligation rather than genuine care, to stop performing family harmony for the sake of keeping surfaces smooth when nothing underneath was actually fine. Bradley's journey continues. He has moved out of the house he shared with Sophie and declined his parents' offer to stay in their guest house. He is renting a small flat, and for what appears to be the first time in his adult life, managing his own circumstances without Helen and Richard managing them for him. Whether that leads somewhere real, I cannot say, but it is at least honest, which is more than most of what came before. The family that has emerged from all of this is smaller, but every person in it chose to be there, honestly, without being arranged or orchestrated or pressured into position. I would take that over any staged reunion photograph, any carefully planned moment of false redemption, every single time.